was actually going to ask you about Wall Street Journal and Murdoch taking it over. What do you think about the deal? What do you think he really holds for it?
Well, Rupert Murdoch apparently will talk about nothing else at the moment. He's obsessed with the journal and he's desperate to get his hands on it because the deal's not, sort of the I's have yet to be dotted, the T's crossed. But if you have lunch or dinner with him, that's all he talks about is what he plans for the journal. And I think he really, he wants to make a big impact. He's getting on in age, though he'll probably live for a long while, but he wants to move quickly to make a big change. And I think what you'll see is it'll become a more exciting paper, it'll become a more dynamic paper, it'll become a more accessible paper, and all of that will be on the plus side. On the minus side, you will never quite know if some of the business stories it's carrying suit Murdoch's agenda or are inspired by Murdoch. He knows he can't go too far on that because the further he goes, he will damage the franchise. Because the franchise in a business paper, above all, depends on independence and integrity. But he won't be able to stop himself from giving the news a nudge in his direction. It won't be as bad as, basically the business pages of the New York Post, which are mainly all about media business, are essentially his own private platform to launch exocets at anybody who's happened to cross him and to cause mischief. He won't do that, he's not stupid, that would destroy the journal. But it will lose that total impartiality and integrity, I would suspect.
That can't be a good thing.
Not in the long run, but it's a swings and roundabouts. The journal has been badly run. The existing management have missed just about every opportunity that come up and hit them on the face. Murdoch will stir that up a bit, and the Chinese wall that exists in American journalism between the editorial pages, where you have one editor, and the news pages, where you have a separate editor. So the theory being that the editorial line the paper is taking has no influence on the news that you carry. That's a very American approach to things. The Times has that, the Washington Post, LA Times. So that won't survive Murdoch. There will not be a Chinese wall between the editorial pages. He won't need to change the editorial pages because he agrees with them all. He said to me once, reading the editorials in the journal was like having a strong cup of caffeine in the morning. Got him going and told him what to think for the day. But I think you will see more the news agenda, the news approach, the emphasis of the news pages being guided, motivated by the editorial line. After all, he does that in every other newspaper he owns. Why would the journal be different?
How long has he coveted it? Way back when you...
Well, he's always wanted a major financial paper. People forget that he did try to buy the Financial Times. And indeed, at one stage, I think it was in the late 80s, he owned 20% of the FT. And I think he would have been prepared to sell the Times in Britain in order to get the Financial Times. He always wanted... Remember, he's a global media giant, and the Financial Times and the Journal are global in a way that the Times of London is not. So he's always like that. He's obsessed with business and finance. If he's not talking politics, he's talking business. And he's always wanted a franchise. He went for the FT. They saw him off, quite interesting. The sort of old-fashioned blue bloods at the FT in these days, Lord Blakenham and so on, they saw him off. And I think if he'd had to choose, he didn't really like the FT. He thinks the FT's run, he thinks it's not just the colour of the paper that's pink. He thinks all the journalists there are a bunch of pinkulous as well. He used to agree, Norman Tebbit used to go around saying there are more communists in the Financial Times than there are in the Morning Star. And I would just laugh. But Murdoch used to agree with him. So he loved the FT, but even more he would have wanted the Journal. The Journal is much more his cup of tea in terms of the editorial line, and it's American, and he's now fundamentally American. It's in New York, he's a New Yorker, so he's got what he really wanted. FT would have been an also-ran, would have been second prize.
This is the jewel.
He got the first prize, and it's the first really true global franchise newspaper that he's owned. Now he's got it, and it comes at a time when he's big in the net. He understands the importance of financial news to the net. It's the one thing you may be prepared to pay for, but also it fits in with his latest TV ambitions, which is he's just launched Fox Financial News in America. So it's a typical, it shows the ability of Murdoch to realize that everything now has to be multi-platform. So the Journal now will be multi-platform in the sense it'll be the traditional newspaper, it'll be the website, but it'll also be on television.
Well, I was just going to be asking you about Murdoch, but you seem to be talking about him quite fondly.
Well, you asked me about the job.
Yeah,
I have spoken. I mean, he hasn't spoken to me for 10 years, so we're not exactly fond. And I'm very glad not to work for him anymore. But I still know a lot about him, and people tend to ask me. I'm just glad I don't work for him anymore. The days of working for Rupert Murdoch are long gone. You have to move on. I've seen so many people cling to his coattails, look for his approbation. It's in some ways to be cut out altogether after we fell out over the book. It's quite a cleansing thing. Gets them out of your life.
How do you actually look back on that time now?
Wonderful. It was a roller coaster time with huge ups and downs, but you wouldn't really trade it for the world. And a lot of what I've been able to do, either on my own or with the Barclays, who are the proprietors of the magazines, or with the BBC, or in Dubai, or most of what I do now comes out of the experience and the confidence that I gained 11 years at the Sunday Times with Murdoch, and also a small, shorter time, but an important time, launching Sky Television in this country. That was an opportunity he gave me that no one else could have done. So was the Sunday Times. He took a huge punt in making me editor at 33, when I hadn't even worked for a national newspaper, never mind being editor of one. And although there was roughs and smooths, and sometimes he runs things in a way which is unnecessarily unpleasant, and he can be unpleasant.
Can you give me an example of when he was particularly unpleasant with you?
He was really unpleasant to me, though he could often be gruff, but he used to treat his tabloid editors sometimes that there were dirt on his foot. He would swear at them, shout at them. He ran his company by telephone terrorism to people like Kelvin Mackenzie, or whoever happened to be the unfortunate person who was editor of the News of the World.
Can you give me an example when you were on the receiving end and you thought, well, why am I working for this man? You know?
Yeah, the receiving end for me, he never shouted at me, he never swore at me. Well, he did once, but it was quite funny because we managed to piss off both the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Malaysia. And he goes, oh, it's the great effing Andrew Neil, not content to take on one Prime Minister, you have to take on two, which I thought was quite funny. But, well, what's your problem? What's your problem? I mean, what other newspaper in the world would take on two prime ministers at once?
So that wasn't a bollocking as such. He actually.
No, he was angry though. He didn't like it. It was causing him problems in Malaysia, where he was hoping to sell his satellite dishes, and indeed that was really the beginning of the end of our parting. But he would never come on the phone and shout or swear at me at what the papers had done. He does treat. I suppose this will be good news for the journal editors. He does treat his quality newspaper editors differently from his tabloid. I mean, he is effectively editor-in-chief of The Sun and the News of the World and the New York Post, and acts as such, and will tell them what to say when he feels so motivated. But he does not behave like that towards his broadsheets. He has more subtle ways of behaving. It's not that he leaves you entirely alone, but he has more subtle ways. I was never at the receiving end of his rough tongue, but sometimes, you know, when you were working your pan off to get the paper out or through difficult times, he would come on and just be unnecessarily grumpy and unpleasant. I mean, I wrote in my book once that there were times, and there would be long periods of silence where he wanted you to fall into a trap, where he wouldn't say anything on the phone from Sydney or New York or Los Angeles. And you would say something, try and keep the conversation going, and he would immediately disagree with it, just to pick a fight with you. And I said, if I told him I just found $2 billion in gold bullion under the desk, he'd probably have said, is that all? Did you find more? And that was the unpleasant bit of it. But
Andrew, do you think he's a contented man? Because whenever I see pictures of him,
no, he's always miserable. Look, he's like me. He's a Scottish Presbyterian. We're always miserable.
Are you always miserable?
No, I'm not miserable. But we're never content.
You always seem quite jolly.
No, I'm not. I'm a lot less miserable than he is. But then his grandfather was a minister, so he's a real Scottish Presbyterian.
So it also is, do you think Murdoch is a grumpy?
Murdoch is prone to, yeah. I mean, he can smile and be charming when he wants, but that's usually when he wants something. His default position is pretty grumpy, yeah. He is, that's his demeanour.
What does that say for someone
That's
that
his
has so
demeanour.
much?
I guess that's what keeps him going at the age of, what, 76, 77? And still looking to buy things like the Journal and MySpace and so on. I think a kind of general dissatisfaction with what he's got keeps him going.
Is that not a sad life, that he's not having some sense of contentment?
Oh, I think deep down he has. I mean, you cannot own the properties he owns, from Fox Studios to the Times of London to the Australian to B Sky B, without having a sense of satisfaction with what you've achieved. I mean, there'll be no one like him. Again, because the age of that dominant, the Googles of the world, that's the new world, not the Rupert Murdoch. So he goes out as, I mean, I just finished a documentary for the BBC, for BBC television, which is the press barons and prime ministers. And we've done the original Northcliffe, who invented the Daily Mail. We've done Beaverbrook, who was the big figure in the run-up to the war, friend of Churchill, and then with the power of the Daily Express after the war. We've done Cudlip, who was probably the most important of the left-wing proprietors, though he was not a proprietor in the proper sense. He didn't own the Mirror Group, but he acted like a proprietor. And we've done Murdoch, and these seem to be the four most powerful proprietors that Britain saw in the 20th century. And within that four, there is no doubt that Murdoch was the most powerful of them all.